everybody. Today we're going to be looking at books about physicians in particular. So actual practitioners, not medical researchers, that's going to be a different one. But today we're going to be looking at the story of women in the history of the medical profession. And there's a lot to get through, so I'm probably just going to be doing ones about individual figures, books about individuals, and not the books about like the history, the general history of women in medicine. And you got to go back to, there are of course women mentioned as medical practitioners in Greece, in ancient Rome, but those kind of are just paragraphs in larger histories. The first one that you kind of have a full book about, and it's one of my favorites, is the Trochula, about Trota of Salerno. And she's a medieval figure. This book was translated, edited, explained by Monica Green. She's really cool. You can follow her on Twitter. But Trota was part of a medical community in Salerno, which had a number of women physicians practicing in it. It was not that uncommon to have women practicing in this particular part of the world in the Middle Ages. And she had a particularly tough job because medieval medicine was largely based on the theories of Galen, the classical theories of Galen. And they didn't really investigate much from there. So if you were a woman and you went to a doctor in the Middle Ages and you were like, I'm having trouble breathing, they would say things like, oh, well, obviously your uterus has wandered up to your chest and we've got to scare it back down to where it's supposed to be again, so we're going to rub feces on your nose. And that's the uterus is going to be like, oh, I don't like smelling feces, and it's going to go back down to where it's supposed to be, and that's your problem. Trota was like, well, maybe that's not it. Maybe the uterus doesn't wander through your body, on its eternal pilgrimage. Maybe instead what I should do is, since I'm here on the Mediterranean, maybe I should talk to a bunch of people from different cultures and figure out what they have to say about treating different illnesses. And then I'm going to write a book presenting those kind of things that seem to work. Rather than just sort of saying that whatever Galen said is right. And so she has a series of writings ascribed to her called the Trochula, and this book presents that and also kind of the history of the book and why that book became so influential in women's medicine, for centuries thereafter. And who actually wrote it. Did she write all of it? Did she write part of it? It all kind of comes down to Green's sort of academic detective work, and it's a really cool book. So this is one of my favorites, not only in the history of women in medicine, but just generally books about the history of science. It's really cool. The Trochula. Moving ahead into the 18th century, one of the major figures in the history of women in medicine is Dorothea Erxlaben. And this book is a pretty great one. Erxlaben is one of those kind of typical figures in the history of women in science, where they're able to get their degree, and then once the system finds out, oh crap, this person was able to get a degree based on the laws we have, we better rewrite the laws to stop this ever happening again. And then a century has passed before another one comes in. So Erxlaben was the 18th century version. She was able to get her degree. And Brinkschulte and Labouvi's book about Erxlaben there's not that much, I don't think there's any books written about her in English that I've come across. This one is in German. And it's got this thing that you see in a lot of German books that just drives me batty. But I don't know if you can see this, but they hate, can you see that there? They hate indenting new paragraphs, and it just drives me nuts. So you get a new paragraph and it's not indented a little bit, so you just have these walls of text. It's like the Berlin Wall just sitting there on the page. But a lot of them do it. I think it's the same thing. Zwar sind es weibliche Hände. Oh, no, that one indents. No, that one indents. It's just this one. So, yeah, it's kind of intimidating because you'll come to pages where there's just no break for the eye whatsoever. And if German isn't your first language, like it's just that little bit of an extra bit of discomfort that makes it a bit rougher. But that's superficial and silly, and I shouldn't have even mentioned it. But it did bug me, and I need to talk to somebody about it. So now that's you. But it's a really cool book. Otherwise, one that if you're interested in the history of women in medicine, this one has information you're just not going to get anywhere else. Chances are, if you hear the term women in medicine, the first person you think about isn't Trota of Salerno or Dorothea Erxlaben. It's Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister Emily Blackwell, who were the sort of leading edge of modern women medical practitioners, women physicians. So this is getting into the 19th century now. People getting degrees in the United States and in England, a lot in France. A lot of women have to go to France to study, to pick up practical experience. And Blackwell, there's a lot written about her. There's all kinds of books about Blackwell. There's more kind of juvenile biographies. She's in compilation works. I like this one, Three 19th Century Women, because it's got Sarah Fraser in it as well. And hers, she's, I think, the fourth black woman to get a medical degree. Yeah, in the United States. And the only other book about Sarah Fraser is not, it's a manuscript that's never been published. So this is as close as you're going to get to her story, but it also has Elizabeth Blackwell in it. So there's not a shortage of books about Blackwell. So I'll look at three in particular because they do different things. One is the book that she wrote. So pioneer work in opening the medical profession to women. So you can get it in reprint editions. Again, reprint editions always have weird editing issues with how it lays on the page, but you can get it and hear sort of her perspective. Is she the most reliable narrator at all times of the history of women in medicine? Well, it's complicated. She was, and you see this a lot. There are these originating type figures, and they break open a profession for a particular group, and then the new wave that comes after them just kind of overtakes them and moves on past them. And it's hard for them to understand, how they were so revolutionary and now they're kind of old-timey, and that's a difficult transition to make. And that goes nicely in Julia Boyd's biography, The Excellent Dr. Blackwell. Talks very nicely about that, about the difficulty of being the person who starts a movement, and how difficult it is psychologically when that movement starts to figure out its own way, and what you then have to do psychologically to deal with that. So it's a good book for that. I have shamefully dog-eared the heck out of it. I'm sorry. I don't do that on older books, but I did it on this one because I needed it. And then, hey, do you want historical fiction about Elizabeth Blackwell? Do you want to read a novel? Well, there's one. The Other Side of Courage is historical fiction about Elizabeth Blackwell. If you want a book with more, speculative dialogue and things like that. Rebecca Crumpler is a really interesting figure. To my knowledge, there's not a full book written about her. She was the first black woman to write a medical text. This is in the 19th century. And even though there's not a book about her, you can pick up that text, a book of medical discourses, in reprint editions. I like you have several options usually when you're getting reprint editions. I like the Forgotten Books people. They tend to just take scans of the original book so that it's all, that's focusing, I don't know. So that it looks like the original 19th century text. It's the nice big letters, it's all the blotches and other bits that makes it feel a little bit more real, instead of it being kind of character recognition and then some weird machine deciding how to format it in kind of confusing ways, which you get with other ones. So yeah, this one, it's cool. It's more her kind of recounting her experience as a physician in the 19th century in her community, and the things that she came across, especially with births and the complications of that. And it's a good text for all of that. So one to check out, and these reprints are pretty cheap. So good one to get for the wider history of women in medicine. All right, time to get serious. So we're going to move on to one of the big events in the history of women in medicine, which is the fight to get women into the university system to get medical degrees in England in the 19th century. And there are some very strong personality figures that are in this movement, and they all have very different approaches and focuses, which makes it kind of a thing that's really fun to talk about amongst people who are like, historians of women in science. It's kind of like debating the Beatles, like, who's your favorite 19th century English fight for women medical degrees figure? There's Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who is kind of the, if we all just work really hard and we keep our heads down, we don't make too much noise, but we're really professional and we never mess up, maybe that will impress the establishment, and maybe then they'll start letting us in. But let's not make any waves. Let's just be super confident. Let's be 170% all the time, and that will get us noticed, and then we'll be allowed into the system. Two books, harder to find. Louisa Garrett Anderson's biography of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. So, it's a biography by a relative. Those always have their issues, but they also give you personal insights that are interesting. I don't know if this is available in a nice reprint edition, but it's one of the rare kind of first-person or close relative perspectives to get. So it's a good one. If you want one that's a little bit more, okay, let's look at this historically, Joe Manton's Elizabeth Garrett Anderson is a bit later. It's kind of the first professional biography of her, and you get that side of the story, that we're going to do it this way, and just her frustration with the other kind of more radical figures in the women's medical movement, and you get it told from that perspective. And if you read this book first, you're like, yeah, those other guys are just messing everything up. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson is working so hard to win women their place, and these guys are just these revolutionaries coming in and messing it up. So if you go this first, you kind of have that prejudice going into Sofia Jax Blake, who is a very, very different figure. And she is much more the figure of, we are going to challenge the system at every possible step. We're going to get in their face, and we're going to demand access. We're going to use every outlet of the media at our disposal. We're going to use every kind of tactic at our disposal to make our dilemma, our situation known. And we're going to get into dirty politics, into the dirty world of politics if we need to, and we're going to make a noise about it. And from Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's perspective, this was unforgivable. This was, painting women medical figures as, irresponsible and unhinged, and it was undoing her work. But from Sofia Jax Blake's perspective, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was just sitting around hoping that something would happen, and that it might take decades and maybe a century for any substantive change to happen. And Anderson constantly talking against what Blake was doing, what Jax Blake was doing, was very frustrating to her, because she's like, I'm trying to get things done. I'm trying to get legislation, meaningful legislation passed, and it doesn't help me that you're kind of condemning me in the papers for what I'm trying to do. So then you read Jax Blake, and you're like, Jax Blake's the cool one. And Elizabeth Garrett Anderson is the one who's getting in her way. So there's two different books. The Margaret Todd biography, which is, again, you have to get this one pretty much in reprint, is a lot of letters and a lot of sort of original documents of Jax Blake and her family writing back and forth. So it's filled with good original sources like that. If you don't like reading a lot of lengthy 19th century letters, then Shirley Roberts' biography gets into the whole, how she was perceived, what job she was trying to do, with a lot less of that. The third kind of big figure in the sort of American-British story of women being fully recognized in the medical profession is Mary Putnam Jacobi, and she might be my favorite. There's some troubling aspects of some of the things that she did, but she is the one who's like, okay, good job, Blackwell and Anderson and Jax Blake, in getting women into universities, getting them to practice medicine. What I'm going to do is get into medical research. So I'm going to be doing laboratory studies of disease and trying to, and also being a major figure in germ theory, and kind of this idea that germ theory is an important and new way to look at disease, which was not universally accepted in her time. And especially some of these figures that we've been talking about were not on board with germ theory. Because especially when you look at like Blackwell, they were much more like, oh no, diseases are, about lifestyle and things like that, and it's not about some just, cold, mindless bug that hits you, whether you're virtuous or not. And Jacobi's like, no, it is. We're going to do the science and do it. So she was not well liked by a lot of those figures, but she was really important. The book by Biddle is Mary Putnam Jacobi and the Politics of Medicine in 19th Century America. I think it's right here, but I'm not going to look at it. It took me forever to get it because I was constantly waiting for it to come down in price a little bit. Used copies were like $60 and $70 and stuff. And finally, I think I found it for like $42, and I'm like, okay, good enough. So yeah, it was pricey at the time, might have come down, but it tells a story that none of those other ones tell, a totally different part of the women in medicine in the 19th century story. This one in America and with medical research. So keep it on your watch list, and if you can find one for under $50, go ahead and grab it. Okay, lightning round. So these are some books that fill in kind of weird, interesting parts. This is Lutzker's Edith Petchy Phipson, she was one of the people who was part of Jax Blake's crowd, and she took her medical knowledge and used it to go to India and to set up medical facilities there. So she's an example of one of the people who's kind of exporting her hard-gained medical knowledge to a different country. Rarity, no, that is rarity. There are some places in Women in Science where you get lots of memoirs and autobiographies, other places where you get basically none, that women in those fields just don't write about themselves. Medicine is kind of in the middle. You got Blackwell writing, Jax Blake wrote some reminiscences. This is called Petticoat Surgeon. And it's the memoirs of Dr. Bertha van Hoosen, which I'm going to I want to say it just so many times, Bertha van Hoosen. It's her account, and she was an important figure And you see her coming up in the training of a lot of other figures that you see in 20th century America. The life of Dr. Anandabai Joshi. This is she was, I think, married at 13 and dead by 21, and she was the first Indian woman to get a medical degree. And this is an account of her by a person who knew her, an admirer of her. And it's a fascinating story, a tragic story of somebody who just really wanted to gain this new medical knowledge to bring it back to her own country, but who died before she could really realize what she wanted to do. So it's a pretty cool one. Elsie Inglis. This is I love the back of it because it's a new series of readable biographies of famous Scots. Readable biographies of famous Scots. It's a great band name. But, so she was important in World War I in creating and staffing hospitals on the front lines run entirely by women. So really interesting figure. This one was a bit harder to find, but it's a really cool story. Speaking of cool stories, Anna Beck. These are her memoirs of being a Siberian doctor in the late 19th century into the Soviet era. So what was it like to be a doctor, to get your medical training under the Tsar, and then to continue doing that through the Russian Civil War, and then continuing to do it through the Soviet era. It's a really fascinating book about practicing medicine in that time. You don't hear those voices very often, so this is just very fortunate that this was brought to light by Rossweiler and Lindenmayer. So really cool book. And then last kind of quick injection, Dr. Mom Chung. This is another interesting story. Woman who is not only significant for the history of Chinese women practicing medicine in the United States, but also just her role in World War II, where she's kind of seized upon as this media darling, as this figure who represents all that's good about our alliance with China against Japan. And so she's kind of seized upon as this propaganda tool while she's trying to make her own life, this very interesting life, as a physician in early 20th century America. So really interesting book. Ronald Reagan kind of improbably shows up in it. Just cool stuff. So that's lightning round books right there. And then we're going to wrap up with one of my favorite figures, Helen Taussig. She's the one who came up with the procedure for correcting the heart defect resulting in blue baby disease, where babies just were not getting enough oxygenated blood because of a congenital defect in their heart. And it's a story that involves her and then the two surgeons, Vivian Thomas and Alfred Blaylock, who performed the procedure that she came up with. Vivian Thomas wrote his memoir of that whole process, Partners of the Heart. It was later on made into a movie, and this cover is pretty representative of the movie's take on it, which is, there's Vivian Thomas, there's Alfred Blaylock, and Helen Taussig is not there. She's not even in the picture. She's in the movie, and she's kind of like this goofy spaz. It's not a great representation, and it's unfortunate. But Vivian Thomas's account is really interesting. You have to have a pretty strong stomach because there's lots of like experiments on animals that are unpleasant. to read about, but it's one of the sources that we have, one of the kind of only sources outside of, more juvenile works. So this one, Trailblazers in Science and Technology, isn't bad. It's got a lot of good actual information in it about how that process worked, and a decent amount about Helen Taussig's part in it. So, so you've got those. You can watch the movie. It's got Alan Rickman in it. That's good too. But in terms of being a fair representation of what Taussig did, and her role not only in that, but in later medical matters, is not great. So, that's a stack of stuff to get you going for a while about the history of women in medicine. Dig in, and we'll see you next time. Bye!